I'm James Champkin, an ultra keen specimen angler. I've been part of the Dynamite Baits team for over 5 years. Well, I've come out on this gloriously sunny early spring day to tell you the story of another one of my most memorable captures. This time, a River Record Barbel. When I started fishing the River Lea for barbel, my goal was a fish of over 15 pounds. I finally managed to achieve that with a stunning barbel weighing 15 pound 9 ounces back in 2019. I was really fortunate to be fishing the Lea during somewhat of a golden period for its barbel stocks, where the fish just seemed to be getting bigger every single year. And that meant that my target moved along with them. Whereas when I started fishing the river, 15 pounds seemed like a difficult but achievable prospect. Suddenly there were fish of 16 and even 17 pounds being caught. So back in the winter of 2021 and 22, I was fishing really hard for a fish of that sort of calibre. I'd had a really difficult season on the river leading up to that point. I just could not seem to put what I'd learned in the previous years into practice. I think come Christmas time, I'd put just one small barbel on the bank, and I was really hitting my head against a brick wall, trying to figure out how to extract one of these massive fish and get it in my landing net. After the new year, at the start of 2022, I had just a couple of months of the season left to put one of these giants on the bank, and I decided that I was only going to fish for the barbel when the conditions were absolutely right. And the absolute right conditions for me meant the biggest floods that I could fish in. That meant those periods in the UK in the winter when we received those big southwesterly weather fronts, bringing milder temperatures and loads of heavy rain. The Lea as a river catchment is very heavily regulated. You've got the Lea Navigation, which is the navigable, canalised part of the river, but you've also got the Lea Flood Relief Channel, which helps reduce the flood risk to the surrounding urban areas. This means that after even long bouts of really heavy rain, the river is always accessible. Now, if we go back a few years previously, I've been fishing the River Rother in Sussex for its own stock of big barbel. And I'd met a guy called Dave Chambers. Dave turned out to be a lovely guy, but also an incredibly proficient barbel angler. Whereas I was really struggling and racking up the blanks, he was making it look easy. And by fishing when the river was at the top of its bank in the biggest floods, he was catching 2 or 3 fish in a session, whereas I was struggling to extract anything at all. What's more, is he wasn't worried about finesse. He was fishing big chunks of luncheon meat with 2 rods in relatively small areas. I was trying to refine everything, make it really delicate for these pressured fish, but just by fishing in the right conditions, he was making a low stock pressured river look relatively easy. I really wanted to try this approach on the River Lea because I thought it would be absolutely perfect with a low stock of big fish that were highly pressured. I was waiting for these conditions to arrive, and in the middle of February 2022, we got exactly that, with 3 massive named storms hitting the UK over the course of a single week. We had Storm Dudley, then Storm Eunice and Storm Franklin just days apart, bringing bout after bout of really heavy rain, huge winds and really mild temperatures to the southern part of England. On the 22nd of February, I finally hit the river, and I found possibly the most perfect alignment of winter barbel fishing conditions that you could possibly imagine. It was a balmy 15 degrees Celsius, the air pressure was through the floor, and we also had a river the colour of strong tea. It looked absolutely perfect for winter barbeling, and also absolutely spot on for that floodwater approach that I'd mentioned earlier. There was only one other car in the car park when I arrived at the fishery around lunchtime, so I decided to have a walk down the whole stretch and scout out 4 or 5 swims to concentrate on through the afternoon and the evening. Now, on this particular day, I remember walking along the river and noticing how the areas all look so different than in normal flow conditions. You know, areas that I'd normally focus on, that were normally pretty productive, has suddenly turned into a boiling, turbulent mess where you just would not want to fish in a flood. And other areas, like normal slacks or slow swims where you'd normally walk straight past, has suddenly become major fishy holding areas, and they just look fantastic. So I made a mental note of 4 or 5 areas that I wouldn't normally fish, but I really wanted to give it a go in these floodwater conditions. These were generally areas where the rising river levels had created new slacks and creases behind bushes and overhanging trees that were normally above the water level. Now, fishing in floodwater for barbel can be extremely effective, but it can also be incredibly dangerous. So it is important to mention a couple of safety tips if you're going to do this kind of fishing. Do wear chest waders and do use a long storm pole to check the depth of flood water before you make any uncertain steps, because the coloured water can make flooded areas look quite shallow when you might actually be treading over an undercut bank. So do have a good prod around with a long storm pole before you step in areas where you're not certain of the depth. So after making a mental note of a few areas that I wanted to focus on, I headed back to the car to get my gear. I settled into the first swim like a lovely long crease down the middle of the river caused by a small bush on the near bank. It looked absolutely perfect. It had no form that I was aware of for producing barbel, but it just looked absolutely perfect on this particular day. It was about 1:30 p.m. by the time I started fishing, and I dropped a big chunk of meat onto that crease, sat back and just waited for events to unfold. I was fishing with a really quite heavy barbel kit, a 2¼ pound Fox Specialist barbel rod, 15 pound main line and a size 4 gripper hook to make sure that I could extract fish of that sort of size from really small snaggy swims. A 3-ounce gripper lead and an 18-inch coated braid hook link completed the setup, meaning I was fishing strong but very effectively, and I could keep my bait pinned exactly where it needed to be. Now, not a lot happened in that first swim. Just a couple of little plucks on the rod tip which I thought maybe eels or small chub, so I moved down to the second area that I'd earmarked. Now, this area was really interesting. It was just above a big set of snags which were a known holding area for the barbel. There were a couple of swims, one on each bank directly below the set of snags, which had produced fish that season and in previous years. But this swim directly upstream was normally completely ignored. It was normally quite shallow, quite nondescript. It had a huge willow overhanging the river just upstream. And in these high levels, that had created a huge slack and a big crease that ran straight down the middle of the river. And where you normally only had 2–2.5 foot of water was suddenly 5 foot deep. And on this particular day, I just stood and looked at it and looked at the way the flow currents were sort of working their way downstream, and it just looked absolutely perfect. This huge crease was going to deflect any debris from my line, meaning that I could fish relatively easily without my lead getting dislodged by leaves and twigs coming down the river. But it also, the crease itself just looked like a perfect holding area for those barbel to work their way up in these floodwater conditions. So I remember dropping in that area about 3 p.m, really took my time to get settled, bank sticks in the river, and just sort of walked to the very edge of the swim and went to swing a big bit of meat out onto this crease. So I swung it about 45 degrees from my position just downstream, landed on the crease and felt a really satisfying donk on the lead. So I knew I was fishing on clean gravel, just this side of the main flow. It looked like a perfect area for a barbel in those conditions to be sat up in. I clipped on a heavy back lead and dropped it off the rod tip just to keep all that pinned down, which really helps with line concealment, stops the barbel spooking off a tight main line, but it also helps reduce the amount of debris that you might get caught up in your line in floodwater conditions as well. So that's a really good tip. It's something I use in all my barbel fishing where possible, a heavy back lead, but particularly useful in heavy flood conditions. So after I clipped on that back lead, positioned the rod really carefully in the rest, tipped quite low to the water, and I remember turning around, going back up the bank, and it started to drizzle by that point. So I just popped up my brolly, and as I went to pop up my brolly, I glanced back to the rod, and I literally just saw the tip wrench round about 6 inches and then just whack the rest of the way around 90 degrees. And I suddenly had a bite. The bait had been in the water for probably 2 minutes on that crease, and suddenly the rod had gone round. And I sort of scrambled down the bank, suddenly lifted the rod and found myself playing this really, really heavy weight. It just didn't really do a lot. It just sort of hugged the bottom and moved upstream along the crease. And I remember just thinking how ridiculously heavy it felt the whole time. It felt like I was playing in a sack, a Hessian sack. It was just ridiculous. Didn't really do a great deal. And because of the coloured water, I couldn't see it throughout the fight until it came to the surface. And it was just doggedly sort of holding the bottom in that crease under the rod tip for what felt like an age, until I finally managed to inch it up. First the back lead came up, then the main lead, and then suddenly this just whale of a barbel appeared on the surface in the tea-coloured water, and I managed to scoop it up in the landing net before it powered back down. And it looked huge. It wasn't until I had a good look in the landing net that I'd appreciated just what I'd caught. It was an absolute leviathan of a barbel. I just could not believe the proportions of this thing. It was built like a breeze block, and I had no idea what it was going to weigh. Bearing in mind the biggest barbel I'd seen on the bank up to that point was that 15.9 that I'd caught from the river a few years previously, and this fish was just in a different league. I was thinking maybe I finally got that 16 or even 17 pound barbel that I'd been fishing so hard for all that season. I remember leaving the barbel in the landing net safely in the deep margins while I went and got the unhooking mat ready, the sling zeroed on the scales, and just everything prepped to get this fish weighed. I lifted up the rim of the landing net and I just was immediately shocked by the amount of weight that was in it. It was just obscenely heavy as I carried it up the bank. And as I laid it on the mat, true width and the depth of the thing just blew me away. I just could not believe the proportions of this barbel. It was unreal. So anyway, managed to position it into the sling, lifted up the digital scales, and well, the number that I saw before me was just mind-blowing. It was 19 pounds 7 ounces of River Lea gold, and my head just went to pieces. Suddenly realised it was a new River record by a few ounces. It was my PB by nearly 4 pounds, and I'd skipped the 16, 17 and even 18 pound mark, and I'd caught a barbel of over 19 pounds. I just, yeah, even talking about it now, I get the same feeling has come back of just disbelief. It was insane. It was so satisfying to be able to put that floodwater fishing theory into practice in such spectacular style. After all that pain and effort and all the blanks that I'd racked up, I'd finally caught a barbel that I felt would do the River Lea justice. And I knew I simply couldn't achieve any more. There really is no finer time than the last few weeks of the river season to catch yourself a huge barbel. They're in peak weight and condition right now, so get out there on the bank and bag yourself a PB.